You're listening to Conversations in Atlantic Theory, a podcast dedicated to books and ideas generated from and about the Atlantic world. In collaboration with the Journal of French and Francophone Philosophy, these conversations explore the cultural, political, and philosophical traditions of the Atlantic world, ranging from European critical theory to the Black Atlantic to sites of indigenous resistance and self-articulation, as well as the complex geography of thinking between traditions, inside traditions, and from positions of insurgency, critique, and counter-narrative. Today's discussion is with Irvin Hunt, who teaches in the Department of English at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, located in Urbana, Illinois. He writes on African American literature and political history, with special emphasis on art, world-making, and their temporalities in the context of a racially fraught society. Our conversation is about his new book, Dreaming the Present: Time, Aesthetics, and the Black Cooperative Movement, forthcoming in early April 2022 with University of North Carolina Press. Irvin, welcome. It's good to have you here.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So I'm really excited to talk about your book. I have to say, I think it's an incredibly important project. Very unique cluster of thinkers, extremely analytical and rigorous, while also having, I think, a really engaging tone. And so I just wanted to say that about the book. I think it has a variety of writerly voices on your part that make it a really pleasant and great read. But it has all of the rigor of a theoretical treatment and sensitivity to the culture and politics of the figures you're talking about. So I just wanted to sort of say that up front, and we'll get into sort of how your readings work and what's behind them and why this figure and that figure and so forth. But I really absolutely love the book. I think it's going to have a huge impact. We just need to get eyes on it. It's going to really change the way we read and think about really key figures, both in the African-American intellectual tradition and also African-American political and social history. So thank you for that book. And so I want to start off with, really a general question. I like to start off with this generally is just how did you come to this project? And that's really an invitation to a personal intellectual narrative. What drew you to what's a very unique collection of thinkers in the project? And also what drew you to the frame through which you read them? Because it's not a positivist history. It's not an empirical project. It's theoretical and political and literary all at the same time. So narrate your way for us into the project.
It began with me wanting to talk about the interaction between art and big political movements. And I gotta say, I don't feel like I found this project. I feel like it kind of found me. When I set out, I thought I was going to tell a story, just basically a very similar story to what we've heard about how these artists were, deeply taking inspiration from the socialist parties that they were part of and working to sort of further the communist cause. And I just thought, well, it's going to be basically the same kind of arc, just different setting in the narrative. And the setting would be the cooperatives that we've forgotten about. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized that story about how people like Du Bois, Ella Baker, people I've left out of the book, like Langston Hughes, Richard Wright, who I've written about being part of this cooperative movement elsewhere. Those folks, this space did not accommodate the narrative that we've had about art and politics, or art and big progressive political movements. And so, the turning point happened for me with Du Bois, and how his and on the one hand, he has this beautiful line in Souls of Black Folk about, right after he talks about double consciousness, where he's talking about the end of this striving is to be is to be the coworker in the kingdom of culture, to be a coworker in the kingdom of culture.
Yeah.
And so we've thought about Du Bois in terms of what brings about particular ends in like a grand like world revolution kind of way. And a lot of people have said the cooperatives were part of that. They're part of this world revolution. And what I found was that he in this space, looking at his letters, that it not only, when he was talking about cooperatives, when he was establishing cooperatives, it didn't seem like he was interested in the end of the world as we knew it at all. Not only that, but he wasn't interested in ends. And this seemed to be a space that was principally about beginning and maintaining this space as a constant renewal. And that flew in the face of Du Bois, the lodestar of historical dialectic and Marxist, you know, overcoming. It just flew in the face of all of the ways that we've thought of Du Bois charting these grand historical arcs of progress. And I just started there. And what it gripped me in a way where I had to change the way I was writing. And so the project was an experience of, well, if our biggest titan in my mind at that time, of grand historical narratives across the 20th century went to cooperatives and thought of this as experimenting with a different kind of organizing,
Mm-hmm.
a different kind of politics. And what about other people who were doing this? And I started seeing that, this was a space in which they could suspend the need for a movement to progress. And one of the big questions was, okay, for me going into it was, this was around, I was deep into the project when, in 2014, when, when Ferguson happened, and just the sort of, at the same time that, BLM was rising, it was also a deeply pessimistic and frightening time to
Yeah, it certainly
organize.
was. Yeah.
And so one of the things that pulled me along in this project is the two questions. One, what does it mean to organize, to organize in a space and create spaces that are never safe?
Mm-hmm.
And two, what does it mean to organize without the promise of a better tomorrow?
Hmm.
And so they, these thinkers, these artists, as I like to think of them, charted various different ways of doing that kind of mass organizing without the promise of better days to come. And that was a revolutionary moment for me, because it then changed all the sort of categories that I
Yeah.
that I use to think of activism and art. And then, the categories that the way I thought of scholarly writing. So it was just a huge, huge transformation in my life.
Well, I'm really glad I asked, because I think that, for anyone listening who's thinking about the book or starting to read it, it's a really great way. I mean, you've just articulated so well the sensibility of the book. And I think it comes out in the writing, that sense of and analysis, that sense of shift of how we understand and think about these particular figures, some of whom are, you know, you know, canonical cornerstones, and others who are understudied. And this book takes big steps towards correcting that. And I want to ask about that in a moment, but maybe just if you could walk me through the title a little bit. I really love the title, Dreaming the Present. But I was struck really by so much by the subtitle, Time, Aesthetics, and the Black Cooperative Movement. And
Mm-hmm.
part of what intrigued me about that subtitle, Time, Aesthetics, and the Black Cooperative Movement, was the way it blends together things that we often keep separate, right? Both in terms of the fields that study, time and aesthetics coming from philosophy, cultural studies, literary theory, and the Black Cooperative Movement, which is, something we would associate with sort of social history and its methodologies. But the subtitle and the content of the book, of course, pushes those together, right? And refuses to say, well, if you want to talk about, Fannie Lou Hamer or Ella Baker, you're doing social history or African American politics as an historical project. You want to talk about Du Bois and Schuyler, you're going to talk about them as philosophers and literary figures and satirists, or, however one goes about that. But you really don't do that at all in the book, right? You push together and refuse these kinds of categorizations. So I also wanted you to walk a little bit through that title. I think, interestingly, in your narrative into the project just now, you really talked about that dreaming the present, right? That sense of what does activism promise? And what does it mean to think about the promise of activism being in the present rather than the future, or bringing
Mm-hmm.
from the past to an end? Um, but in terms of the subtitle, especially Time, Aesthetics, and the Black Cooperative Movement, I'm just curious to hear you talk about how the trajectory of the book and how you work as an intellectual and as a writer, how you feel like you were able to successfully sort of break those boundaries between philosophy and cultural theory and social history and politics. Really just walking through that subtitle.
Sure. Yeah. I wrote, I tried to write to the people rather than the discipline. And but by what I mean, and I did that, I look at the book now and I can see how, I did that with varying degrees of success. But, I was, these folks they didn't have any disciplinary boundaries in their reading. And of
Hmm.
course, we know that with Du Bois, but we know that less with Fannie Lou Hamer. We know that Fannie Lou Hamer had, I mean, the sort of technical knowledge that she had to have of cooperatives, of organization, of a mass organization, like she was like she founded with her Freedom Farm Cooperative. The sort of technical knowledge that she learned, and who someone like Ella Baker was reading, not just Marx and these big political theorists, but she was also reading economists,
Huh.
and
Hmm.
of course she was, and so really just trying to keep up with
Hmm.
their
Hmm.
thinking was where, I said, okay, I mean, that I just tried to pull from as much, you know, discourses as I could, simply to keep up with their own philosophies and their practices.
Hmm.
Um, so um, there's another part to that. I realized that the the way that these activists, you know, typically understood, like, Hamer and Baker are considered activists, not considered artists. And the way that they have been separated from artists like George Schuyler and Du Bois have been very similar across disciplines. So across, sociological studies, rhetoric has taken up Hamer and Baker for their, speeches, but
Hmm.
they've treated them very similarly, and so there was a kind of through thread through this that needed to be, that needed to be threaded out for me,
Yeah.
and that I describe as, the beginning at the end of what they were up to, beginning with what they created rather than the process of their creation. And so I was trying to get at the beginning points. Um, and to do that, I needed a lot of the terms and the thinking about, what a cooperative is, and what, it's the microeconomic studies of cooperative establishments and firms and all that.
Hmm.
But on a whole, I kind of felt like there was a shift that needed to be called it toward activism and art, and a shift of thinking in E.P. Thompson's term, who E.P. Thompson's words. How do you account for activists who are present at their own making? How do you account for a movement that's present at its own making? And
Hmm.
that was um, a huge directive for me in sort of shifting the a methodology that I think, as different as literary studies is from the approach of social sciences, um, shifting that approach to beginning at the beginning points
Hmm.
and trying to chart, you know, the process of it unfolding rather than the process of what it produced.
So I mean, I really love that way you put it, as trying to keep up with the people you're studying, right?
Yeah,
You're writing to and thinking, in pursuit of these figures.
yeah,
And I really love that. I mean, I think we could all, benefit from a good dose of that in our scholarship, right? It's a sense of humility in terms of, who and what the person was. But I think it's especially, urgent, and you've already said this, so it's a little bit of repetition. But if you're talking about, Hamer and Baker and the way they get taken up, I mean, rhetoric in terms of speeches, perhaps, but really in terms of social and political history, what's lost is a sense of them as, just to put it in kind of boring terms, sense of them as intellectuals.
absolutely.
And that's, when I read the book, I was like, you know, this is how we need to be talking about Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker. They need to be
Yeah,
talked about. They can be talked about lots of ways, but
yeah,
they need to be taken very seriously as thinkers. And I think in that way, this book, it doesn't necessarily upend things, but it fundamentally changes the way at least those two figures are understood. I think in terms of Schuyler and Du Bois, you unlock dimensions, especially with Du Bois, who's been so, widely written about. You are able to unlock a different dimension of him. But I think even with Schuyler, the seriousness with which you take him as seriousness, you take him as a thinker, right, has a similar effect. But as a literary figure, I think that's a little bit more habitual. But Baker and Hamer emerged so different out of this project, and I just really love that. I think it changes everything, actually.
yeah. I just I just couldn't believe how consistent Fannie Lou Hamer was discussed as somebody who just spoke from her heart, her instinct, someone who
Yep.
tells it like it is, exposing the truth, as if there was no craft, as if there was no art, as if there was no imagination and deep thinking in what she was up to. And um, we've focused on these folks as people like Hamer for what they did, and never have still to take seriously enough what they said and how they said it, you know, let alone how they did it. And so I tried really hard to think of, to just remember how much imagination went in to things that looked slapdash, spontaneous, or simply pragmatic.
In a weird way, the success of a charismatic person can conceal that, as well
Absolutely.
as often. I mean, it reminds me in a sort of
Hmm.
analogy or parallel case. I remember seeing an interview, I think it was a television interview on a talk show with Miles Davis, and the interviewer being shocked to learn that he practices improvisation. And I remember Miles Davis just, I mean, Miles Davis was an asshole. And so he goes into full asshole mode, but he's like, who do you think I am?
Yeah.
Like, I practice all the time,
Yeah.
nonstop. That's
Yeah.
all I
Oh,
do.
that's
And so
such a good
this
point.
idea that, that we would miss the craft, as you put it, I like that. The word I was thinking is study, but you're
Mm.
right. It's craft, study, thinking, that contemplative part. And, and so this this image that you had of sort of running after the thinkers,
Mm-hmm.
of the figures, trying to keep up with them and try to get your writing to catch up with them, is fascinating. And it's, for me, a really important part of the hermeneutic process, right? That the sort of basics of hermeneutics are that the text says something, right? And so part of reading a text is the craft of listening, right? The way you put it is running in pursuit of trying to catch up or keep up with them. But there's also what we bring to the text, right? That we as readers not only try to keep up with the text, but we also select a path that we want to keep up. And so, I wanted to hear a little bit about your own, the sort of way, more conventionally we would put it is, what your framing of your readings, just to run with Baker and Hamer, but also Du Bois and Schuyler. I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about that and what you think your framing is able to draw out of the figures that we wouldn't otherwise see. Because I always think of readings and framings and hermeneutic engagement as like putting a stain on a piece of wood that draws out its grain. That grain
Yeah.
was always there, but it was not visible without the stain. So that application, that art form of staining a piece of wood draws out the grain, just like you as a reader are able to draw things out of Hamer and Baker, Schuyler and Du Bois that we wouldn't otherwise see were you not framing your encounter with them as figures, their writings, and their histories.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I mean,
what is that treatment that you use in the book?
and
How
I mean
would you
the
describe it?
framing. I mean, just being thinking of them first as artists, and artists in the Baldwinian sense of creative living.
Yeah, I like
Thinking
that.
of them beginning with that, then said, so what do you do? Then the question was, what do you do with thinking of them as in a kind of logical sense,
Mm-hmm.
where right where the where you think, okay, this makes intuitive sense what they're up to and how they're if you're thinking of them as artists, you've got to then suspend what you would imagine as logical or intuitive. And so so my frame was, the archive has been approached as in an intuitive manner, and so for both the archive and of course they are the archive, you know what would it mean to think of their what they're up to counterintuitively, and also just as what doesn't seem to make any sense. So for example, we would think, of course, that someone like Baker is a champion of egalitarianism, but it might not make sense to think of her as someone who considers it part of her practice to unsettle her very own practice, to dismantle what she's actually
Yeah.
building as she builds it. And so, my concept of planned failure is basically also is basically kind of a picture of I think probably the neatest picture of the frame that I give to the counterintuitive and approach that I give to all the writers,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
all the artists. We've thought of movements. That's the other thing too, is that movements, leftist movements, have had a sad story in social history.
Yeah,
They
that's
failed
for
to meet.
sure.
They failed to meet. Yeah,
Yeah.
and so it is then the consequence of that is the sort of Afro pessimism that we see today, and the consequence of that narrative, and so we've thought of them as failed plans, and so one of the ways I'm trying to unsettle that is to think of, well, particularly Baker and Schuyler together in terms of planned failure, and sort of that to me is the sort of counterintuitive approach that is required if you seriously consider them as imaginative craftsmen who aren't working in the realm of pragmatic logic, who are working in the realm of imagination and something that to me can only be compared to dreams.
Mm. I really like that. Yeah. And I think that, as you put it, that Baldwin sense of artist,
Hmm.
that in itself, when my question, the question I put in terms of the sort of hermeneutics of reading, what do you bring in terms of a frame, and just that frame alone of Ella Baker as artist, it absolutely transforms the appearance of Ella Baker. And I really like, just to also just underscore what you said, you mentioned the word archive, and this is one of my sort of obsessions is, the empirical sense of archive as like somebody's papers at a university somewhere, and you sit in the library with your grant money, right? That's great. It's fantastic. Love that. But, what you articulated is the life of organizing, that narrative and that life story is an archival document. But it's an interesting archival document because it doesn't exist in this reproducible form. It's an archival project that emerges out of your handling of Ella Baker's story. And so for me, that's really interesting, the way this book changes the way Ella Baker's archive, Fannie Lou Hamer's archive, appears to us, precisely because of this framing of them as artists, and the way then their life becomes a series of creations for us to contemplate, work with, and so forth. So I just mention of that word archive is really for me really fascinating.
No, yeah. And to remember that they were archiving their own practice too. Um,
Yeah.
you know.
They were serious people, and that's, I mean, I think that's a sort of boring thing to say, but I think taking them seriously as serious people is something that
Yeah.
your book does really
Yeah.
uniquely.
Yeah.
What drew you to these four? I mean, I think, for
Yeah.
example, you want to write a book about time and aesthetics and Black social history and politics in the U.S. Du Bois obviously pops up. Schuyler's a little bit of a quirkier figure, I think criminally understudied.
Mm-hmm.
Sage of Sugar Hill, one of my dear friends, the late Jeff Ferguson, wrote a great book on Schuyler. But and then Baker and Hamer, that's the combination of figures is makes the book unique. In every book, I think, that's what you want. You want to take up something different. But what drew you to these particular four figures? You've talked about it a little bit, but maybe just, what is it about them that drew
Yeah.
you, other than they were not they were criminally understudied or
Yeah,
hadn't
yeah,
been
yeah,
put
yeah.
in
Sure, sure,
conversation,
sure.
right?
I mean, the first thing was that these were folks that stood out in my mind because of how deeply involved they were in establishing cooperatives.
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing was just how much pleasure it was to read their work and to read Baker's essays and and so I also, the historical stretch was lovely for me too. To begin right at the end of the 1890, to begin at the end of the 1890s and end in the 1970s was a nice historical stretch that I felt like they could carry. Um, but there's people I could have talked about: the Black Panther Party, members of the Black Panther Party and the Breakfast Club. I could have talked the Breakfast Program. I could have talked about Marcus Garvey and Amy
Mm-hmm.
Garvey, and so it also just became, how much time do I have to
Yeah.
seriously study and churn out concepts of activism, because every chapter took about 2 years. So
the way these books, they show up and they're, 190 or whatever pages, and it just does
Yeah.
not look like those years.
It doesn't look like the
No,
exactly.
it never does.
So,
But I mean, I have to say, I think that's a real strength of the book, and this says as much about me as anything else. But I like the focus of the book, because it would have been so easy, once you talk about cooperatives, to talk, as you say, I mean, about Garvey, about Stokely Carmichael's organizing work, about the Black Panther Party. It is that's so expansive, but this collection of thinkers is it's a unique selection, and it also allows you to give real integrity to your readings. There's no glossing over anything in this, which is um, it's hard to do when you talk about a big ideas like time aesthetics and cooperative.
yeah.
But the anchoring of that analysis and figures is I think really what makes the book special, rather
Yeah.
than interesting and intriguing, which are these broad stories are also completely fascinating. But
And it's helpful, the size of the archive that Baker has left behind. I mean, it's helpful that the voluminous size of Hamer's archive in various different places. So for a first book, this was something I felt like I could manage with these four.
finding things you can manage, that's yeah, it's not a conversation with me, but I have a book I'm trying to get started on, the danger is that it's an uncontrollable series of curiosities. So let me ask you
Now you
about
have the
the
freedom,
maybe. um it's just, will it drive me to just uh go ride my bike around rather than write because it's too big, or
Yeah.
find something really great to say. um well, let me ask you about a phrase. Like I said, I mean, I think the book's really well written. It doesn't read, for what it's worth, like a first book at all. It just, the writerly voice, and that's part of the depth and detail you get in each of these readings. I think the content is fantastic, and the writing itself is really quite brilliant. And I loved this phrase that I'm going to read, and I just want to ask, what's going on in this phrase, and how do you think it captures something about the book? And this is the quotation. I don't have the page number here, actually, but you write, "A people in peril bejeweled the ruins, trying to ruin them. A people in peril bejeweled the ruins, trying to ruin them." If bejeweled, ruins, and ruination, and a people. It's an amazing part of a sentence. So
Yeah, I was reading Toni Morrison's Sources of Self-Regard at the end of the book, and Morrison was reflecting in that on her grandma, and saying that her great grandmother, and she was saying what the single greatest fascination for her throughout her career, and will continue to be, is why the circumstances of her great grandmother's life were so inferior to the quality of that life, and why over and over again a people made that were treated like beasts, treated like cargo, never ended up as beasts or cargo, and in fact took those sources and mechanisms of oppression and did something. She calls it civilizing to them, and I call it beautifying or beautiful. And so there's, and I thought this was basically the essence of this book, that there was a wholesale redefinition of a system of values that was happening over and over again, in such a way of system of values, in such a way that the oppression didn't touch their lives in the way that we've thought in the way that we've said it's touched their lives, and and so you have this transvaluation going through the entire book, but you also have this conjunction between what Brett Edwards beautifully calls it catastrophe and chance. Um,
Yeah.
and you know, and that kind of that mess, the mess of that entanglement is what I thought was both charging, what both made this work so alive and also so revolutionary.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is a kind of beautification of something that would otherwise be seen as completely vile.
Yeah.
And that beautification is this redefinition of what we value, what we want to keep, and what in in our oppressors' eyes we don't want, you know.
Yeah.
And so from and it got me to, I think, one of the biggest takeaways for me of the book was, um it's equally important to discuss the way that the systems of terror have ended these forms of activisms and all of that,
Mm-hmm.
as it is to talk about the things that they built, the things that they created,
Mm-hmm.
um, in the very meeting points of themselves and those, and those systems and those forms of oppression. Um, because it suggested to me that we don't have to wait we don't have to wait for something, that we have what we need to have what we want.
Yeah.
And that was a huge, that was a huge, and sort of empowering lesson that I felt like I got at the end of writing it.
Yeah, I think in that way, you're able as a reader of these figures, because as I was, saying before, the dynamic of reading is such that, we bring something to the material brings something to us. But I think there's a sort of Baldwin like touch there, or as you were saying, Morrison as well, touch to that ability to say, you know, it's not a choice between, abjection and liberation. There's life that happens in between these. And it's life
Absolutely.
that is about creation. And it's
Mm-hmm.
also life that's about articulation of want and desire. I mean, when you were just
Mm-hmm.
talking, I was thinking about what Baldwin
Mm-hmm.
says in the long essay portion of The Fire Next Time, when he says, we don't want to be integrated in, speaking as African American, right? We don't want to be integrated into a burning house.
Mm-hmm.
And so what does it mean to say we don't want to be in your house, but we also don't want to be this?
Yeah.
But this, Baldwin has such a
Mm-hmm.
complex sense of, what he called for his period, right, what he called the ghetto, right? Absolutely abjection, hustlers, predatory ministers, all of those things. But at the same time, it's full of life and literature and art and beauty. I like that, beauty and bejeweled are the terms you come back to, because I think those give a, just rhetorically, a sense of elevated substance that's really important. And it also values what might be at times ephemeral, right? Rather than the ephemeral moments of bejeweling the ruins that want to ruin.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Instead of that being a sort of pathetic, sort of Don Quixote kind of moment, instead, this is like something really important is happening here.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
absolutely animates the book. And
Mm.
I really like the way you talked about it there.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks.
And it brings me to this other question, and I think you've gotten into it, but so it's really more of a shift in vocabulary. In African American thought, or even sort of diasporic thought more broadly, you mentioned pessimism and Afro pessimism and
Mm.
Ferguson earlier in our conversation, but we have. I think one of the things that Afro pessimism, whatever one thinks about particular figures and their articulations of this sort of wandering school of thought. One of the things it has drawn out for me under the term Afro-pessimism is this animating kind of dyad in the African American tradition for sure, but also I think in the Caribbean tradition as well, of nihilism and hope, right? And that these things tend to be sort of as you know, Ralph Ellison and James Baldwin on the side of hope, and Richard Wright on the side of pessimism,
Yeah.
right? And it's, I think, a really interesting
Yeah.
like structure to
Mm-hmm.
interpret. And I'm
Yeah.
curious how you see your book fitting into that. I mean, you've spoken to
Yeah.
it in some
Yeah.
ways
Yeah.
that are kind of like it upsets that dyad. And so I wanted to mention this
Yeah.
because I
Sure.
think it's a way of situating your book in the African American intellectual tradition broadly, as a way of saying, like, a way of seeing how you take on that dualism or dyad or binary in
Yeah.
really important ways.
Yeah. I mean, what's astounded me um, is I totally agree with that. And what has astounded me is that we have completely, let me not be totally dramatic here, but the category of the present has just been grossly underthought.
Hmm.
And what has been thought in place of that is either a melancholic idea of the past as the present. So the present doesn't even exist because the past is all there is,
Yeah.
and that would be that nihilistic side.
Hmm.
Or the present only exists to the extent that it can take us to alternative futures.
Yeah.
And so basically the present doesn't exist because the future is all we want to talk about. And
Yeah.
so this category of the present as something that, yeah, it is that was the greatest intellectual challenge, to talk about something that seems like you you know is seems so fleeting and all that. But this category of the present has been lost, and it's lost ironically at our very turn away from pessimism to what a lot of folks call prefiguration, basically, performing now what you want to have last later,
Yeah.
what you want to sustain later. It might not last, but like, let's just put it into practice and see what happens. At least we are, prefiguring it.
Hmm.
And so even at that moment, the present is only valuable in its deference to what might come. And I needed to think about the present not in just simply terms of a second that's gone, or the thing that's simply in the Benjaminian sense, the moment that is lost as soon as you see it, but different ways of different ways of charting the present across space. So
Hmm.
so so a simultaneity, for example, in Hamer, where like she is actually describes herself as someone who is existing in two spaces at once. Well, what does that do to her sense of time? If
Huh.
she's
Yeah.
saying that I'm in Wisconsin right now, and I also am in Mississippi,
Hmm.
you know,
Hmm.
and people just sort of overlook that as, well, you know, to sort of explain that away. And it's like, no, there is something incredibly illogical and also something incredibly powerful that she's doing, to think about how she's imagining temporality and how she's imagining rethinking the present. And so, I mean, my principal contribution is certainly the way I'm trying to flesh out new ways of thinking of the present, which is why that subtitle begins with time.
And I think that example of in Wisconsin, in Mississippi, taking that seriously as an existential statement that needs a theoretical
Yes,
treatment rather than a rhetorical
exactly,
flourish of
exactly,
saying I'm really from Mississippi. Or, I mean, you can
right,
see how that
yeah,
gets spun, but taking
yeah,
it seriously,
yeah,
again, it goes to this, activists. How seriously do we take activists as intellectuals? And that's a great example of it. But I love that. I mean, it really, for me, what you're talking about with the present, obviously dreaming the present is the title. And it really, that dreaming part of the present the way you were talking about it, it's a way of retrieving the present from it being simply a way station of the past or the future, but instead it's
Yeah.
full of it has a dreamlike character. It's
Yeah.
fattened up, it's expanded, it's
Yeah.
wandering,
Yeah.
it's untamable in some ways, it's
Yeah.
highly articulated.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
when you in the book you talk, obviously it's a book about African American artists, activists, thinkers, but and the intellectual tradition. And so you draw so much on the African American intellectual tradition, both in the primary figures, but also in the sort of apparatus around it. But, you also draw on European theorists, Caribbean theorists here and there, Latin American theorists. And so I'm
Mm.
curious how you make sense of your array of sources. I mean, a sort of straightforward answer is, well, these are people I've read and they inform how I think. And so I'm just being sort of bibliographically
Yeah. Right.
responsible. But I also wonder if there's something instructive about those theorists,
Mm.
that your story, which is a story about, what is it, 80
Mm.
something year expanse in the United States, maybe the fact that these other thinkers can so easily buttress your analysis suggests that there's a wider story to be told about the Americas.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what's interesting is how, in terms of the civil rights movement and in terms of Black activists, there seems to be like a triple domestication going on that I think I'm trying to undo with the help of these more these non-local theorists. And there's take a person like Hamer. She's domesticated in terms of speaking for the South, and she's domesticated in terms of uh, speaking for blacks in inside of this country, and also her relationship inside of the home space and who she was inside of the home space, and and also domesticated in terms of an intellectual tradition. And I think that what's interesting is you take Hamer in 1964. She went to New Guinea. She went to Guinea in 1964, um, and it was in a meeting that she had with members of the Minister of Commerce in Guinea, with her and the other 11 folks from Student Nonviolent Coordinating, um, from SNCC, um, in which they talked about, which in which she heard about the importance of cooperatives to Guinea. And
Hmm.
she came back and she said, and Harry Belafonte put this trip together for these SNCC folks, and he said that there was no one he thought that was more transformed from this almost a month long um, interaction with Toure, with the president of Guinea, and all these other folks in the newly independent cabinet, who was more transformed in this trip than Hamer. And so she comes back and she's no longer thinking about simply, the local, and talking about, she asserts that she's in 1971, she gives this speech where she's asserting that she's not simply concerned with black folks. She's concerned with the freedom of Mexicans, of Latin Americans, of indigenous folks. And she says one of her most famous lines, um, I'm not free till everyone is free. And this everyone is consistently taken as a sort of black domestic space.
Yeah.
And 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 just forgotten. What's forgotten is the previous solidarities that she's charting with the broader diaspora. And so I feel like when you think about these movements in relationship to the autonomous, like, think about um, uh, the autonomous movements in Argentina and Spain, and how there is a larger response to a global order of colonization that's at play,
Yeah.
that requires us transgress our own disciplinary lines and lines of political discourse, in ways that these folks were already doing.
And that expansion of local movements in that international context, it's interesting to me how quickly that does get lost in, I don't want to just say scholarship, but in our sensibility about the time. I mean, this was, I think about, it's not a focus of your book, but the way we can talk about King and the war in Vietnam and his relationship to that, which is absolutely true. But that tends to get cast as, American imperialism and critique of it. But the Vietnamese were fighting an independence war. And so it was also about their anti-colonial war that preceded the U.S. intervention and that sensibility. The Black Panthers, I think there's a wider sense. And of course, Stokely Carmichael moving to Guinea, changing his name, Kwame Ture. That's a sort of mythical, or Cleaver moving to Algeria, or so many of the Panthers moving to Algeria. But I really like that, that reminder, which is such a transformative reminder, that these figures we so deeply identify with the local were themselves expansive and international. In some ways, it rings a little bit of a sort of reinvention of what Gilroy did in Black Atlantic, which was to remind everybody that these African American thinkers were rooted around the Atlantic world, and this awakening of this, just a reminder, really, of these histories. In
Yeah.
being in Guinea and being transformed by their work of reinventing the state in a post-colonial context. That
Yeah.
that
And
embeds figures in a whole other set of thoughts, as you're saying.
absolutely. I mean, and now with, the approach of Black History Month, it's important to remember that category of Black
Yes.
extending far beyond
Yeah.
African Americans, and so, you know,
So what do you want? Imagine readers, which you will have readers. That's both amazing and terrifying if you're like me. I
yeah,
always say, my greatest nightmare is that no one will read my book, but also the greatest nightmare is that someone will read my book. But people will read the book, and uh, you know, anxiety about people reading what you wrote aside. Maybe you don't have it. Um,
yeah.
but what do you want the walk away, not the takeaway, but the walk away for readers? And I say that because, like, the takeaway is now I have some ideas and I move on. The walk away is like, this is something I carry with me. What do you want readers to carry away, like, ideally?
Mm. I mean, I think the first thing is I want them to feel the desire and the joy of committing or recommitting themselves to the mystery of activism.
Hmm.
And that, requires also, that goes back to thinking of activists and activism itself as a wellspring of imagination. And so that recommitment to the mystery, for forgetting our categories or suspending them,
Mm-hmm.
is probably, and is what I tried to do sentence to sentence myself. And what terrifies me, I guess, is how well, readers think I either did or did not pull that off. But but
That's
I
that's the mystery of
that's
of sending something off to be read. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. But yeah, I think maintaining it as a mystery, is my hope, that that readers walk away from, this with. And also, it's we're just this sort of, the lesson of cooperatives itself, of gathering folks together, gathering the resources together in a single space, and the resources that one has currently, as enabling the things that they want. The lesson, I hope that readers walk away from, is that we do have at least if we take these folks seriously, they seem to be saying we have what we need to have what we want, and that sort of changes the way we interact with the state in terms of our in terms of our organizing um, and our mobilizing.
I love that. How about you? Where does the book lead you? And I mean that partly, how were you changed by the book, but also where does it lead you to next projects? And I promise I'm not doing this thing of like, what's your next book, which, you have a right to exhale after your first, but maybe you want to talk about sort of ongoing
No,
projects. But I really mean,
yeah.
on the one hand, readers walk out of a book, but so do authors. And so I wonder
Hmm.
what you carry with you walking out and what direction it leads you.
Yeah, I I'm I'm very much interested in other alternative communities that I did not get to, that I yeah, just didn't even have on my radar at the time.
Mhm.
And I'm interested in, right now I'm thinking a lot about Move, and they it's just
Yeah.
some of these alternative communities like Move in Philadelphia, which, Move is not an acronym, it was a statement, that,
Mm-hmm.
all
Yeah.
life, we are all life, and all life moves, so we must move constantly. You know it's the same sort of re assessment of these alternative communities seems to be in order. I mean, in the sense that Move as this, challenge to how we think, these folks who were thinking of eco justice and animal rights and extending what we understand ourselves as humans to be, and
Mm-hmm.
all the things that they were practicing, this belief system that they were practicing, is totally overwhelmed by the state terror that of
Yeah.
1985, when, the city of Philadelphia dropped a bomb on their headquarters, killed 6 adults, 5 children, and also decimated 60 something homes in that
Mm-hmm.
black neighborhood. Let the mayor saying, or the police chief saying that the fire department was not to attend to the burning and let those houses burn, and so that huge story just overwhelms what they did, what they built, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so we spend so much time thinking about the burning, and I want to go back to thinking about the building. And so that's essentially, that's where I'm beginning right now, and I'm hoping to sort of stretch that study across various alternative communities in the space of creative nonfiction. So different genre switch, and also, sort of an extension of what I'm up to, the kind of folks I'm looking at
Uh-huh.
now.
Fantastic. Well, I know I speak for a lot of people when I say I look forward to where all of this takes you, because that idea of dreaming the present and remembering life before the burning is just
Yeah.
so crucial to not just new horizons of scholarship, but to the dignity and integrity of how Black people have lived. And I think
Mm.
this book, Dreaming the Present, really gets so deeply into that I think we as readers will carry that sensibility with us. And I really look forward to how that carries with you. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you making the time to talk about this great book. Thank you for it. And I look forward to talking about your next book.
Thanks. Absolutely.
All right. Take care.